Welcome to my Dune Part 2 review. So I saw Dune Part 2 on the 25th of February at an early fan screening. And to be honest, it was one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had at the movie theater. If you take away anything from this review, I just want to stress that this movie needs to be seen in IMAX. It is so stunning. I totally understand people who are a little squeamish of some of the IMAX pricing issues, or maybe just don't like to go to the movie theaters too often because it's expensive. But just do yourself a favor and make this movie the one movie of the year that you go see in IMAX. It's just worth it. I'm not going to say anything more about it. Another thing, the first thing I want to say is if you like Dune Part 1 because of the world building, I think you're going to like Part 2 even more. If you like Dune Part 1 because of the Paul Atreides coming of age character arc, I think with that context behind you, with the rest of his story and how it unfolds, I think you're going to be very satisfied. I like Timothée Chalamet quite a bit. I didn't like him in Wonka, personally. I think Jeremy Allen White should have played Wonka. I thought he did an amazing job in Bones and All, which is a really underrated horror movie about cannibalism. I loved his performance as Paul in Dune Part 1. And honestly, this is his best performance yet. Like, it might be the most surprising thing about Dune Part 2. Timothée Chalamet's transformation into Paul Muad'Dib is pretty incredible. Now, I'm recording this 4 or 5 days after I've seen it. I can't stop thinking about this movie. I've already talked to a bunch of people who've seen it early as well. I was on Chris Gore's channel. He has a show called Versus, and we talked about the differences between the book and the movie. We had an interesting conversation about Part 1 versus Part 2, and on that stream, I talked about how I'm having a very difficult time separating the two parts after having seen Part 2. I loved Part 1. I do think that it's difficult to view it in the same way that I do, say, Kill Bill Volume 1, for example. Kill Bill Volume 1 for me had a more definitive climax, and it had a more definitive story structure. When I look back on Dune Part 1, after having seen Part 2, it seems very much like a prologue to me. And what I mean by that is, the events of Part 2 are so epic in scope, and I think the overall structure of the movie is so much more satisfying, especially when it comes to a balance between action, entertainment, storytelling, character development. I think Part 2 does a slightly better job. Once again, Part 1 is awesome. I think I probably would, as a standalone movie, I would give it something like maybe an 8.5, 9 out of 10. But the action is so minimal. The character development of Paul is fantastic. But in Part 2, I think almost every character is improved upon. And Part 2 has some of the most entertaining and gorgeous action scenes I've ever seen in any movie. And there's some people out there calling this the sci-fi Lord of the Rings and comparing it to like the Two Towers. Don't go into this movie expecting anything like that, because this is a war movie, but the battle scenes are not quite as epic as those films. What I'm talking about is how intense they are. There's 3 or 4, maybe 5 smaller skirmishes throughout the movie, and then there's a giant battle somewhere in the movie. But all of these smaller battles are so well done, and they're so interesting and unique. All of them are different. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but my favorite one involves a spice harvester being attacked, and that scene is so well choreographed. When I was watching it, it felt like I was there participating in the battle. It was so epic. When I do a spoiler review, I'm going to gush about this scene for like 10 straight minutes probably. And that's just like a 5-minute skirmish in the middle of the movie. There's a couple of those, and then there's another giant battle. So yeah, the action scenes in Part 2 are incredible. However, that doesn't take away from the story or the characters. I think there's a perfect balance here. I think somehow Villeneuve has discovered the perfect balance between entertainment, story, characters, and visual poetry. There's going to be slow parts to this movie. If you think Part 1 was slow and you don't like it, you might not like parts of this movie. But the slow parts of this movie are really cool because they do a lot of essential world building. There's stuff with the Fremen societies. There's a conflict around religious dogma. The Harkonnen home planet, Giadi Prime, is way more fleshed out in this movie. I think a good 20 minutes of the movie takes place on Giadi Prime, and it's maybe the best part of the whole movie. The Reverend Mothers and the Bene Gesserits, they get more development. And the character of Arrakis, right, the planet, which is a character in this movie, absolutely. It is the best presentation of Arrakis I've ever seen. We get to explore some of the Fremen colonies. We get to see sandworms in action. There's a couple scenes involving sandworms. One of them is actually kind of terrifying, and it's pretty amazing. It's like my second or third favorite moment in the whole movie. And the opening to this movie, the first scene in the entire movie, has a really amazing immersive feeling to it. It actually kind of reminded me of Christopher Nolan for some reason. It's a really clever sort of action suspense scene, and the cinematography just sucks you in immediately, especially in IMAX. I felt like I was in the desert. So yeah, the aesthetic and world building and cinematography and production design and presentation of this movie is flawless, and it actually exceeded my expectations. As far as the story is concerned and some of the book adaptation elements, right? There's a lot of people talking about how this movie deviates from the book in significant ways. I've read the book twice. From my perspective, the creative freedoms that Villeneuve took with this movie and some of the deviations from the book are pretty glaring. However, I think in many cases, this is much more accurate to the book than the 1984 Dune. Although there might be different interpretations of certain characters that you prefer in the David Lynch version or the miniseries, I don't think there's a single bad interpretation in this movie. The one that a lot of people are talking about is Shani, and how her story is very different from the book and how her character deviates from the book. However, in Villeneuve's version of the movie, like part 1 and 2, the whole experience, I think it's perfectly reasonable the way he presents her character. She also acts as sort of a conduit for the viewer and the questioning and skepticism of messianic archetypes and the concerns of false prophecies and things like this, right? And when you're adapting a book with grand philosophical ideas, I think it's sometimes essential to distill a lot of that into a character that can present these ideas in a way that is relatable. And yeah, I just personally appreciated how they presented her character in this movie. With that being said, I think Shani and her character is one of the more difficult things to anticipate in when recommending this movie to people. As far as the other characters are concerned, Stilgar is amazing. Javier Bardem. He's very funny in this movie. I didn't expect that. And I liked it. He's not very funny in the book, but I actually like what they did with this in the movie. Earlier, I talked about the Bene Gesserits, but we have Lea Seydoux in this movie as Lady Margot, and she was incredible. Lady Jessica, Rebecca Ferguson's character, is so good. She has a lot more going on in this movie. There's a lot of conflicting things happening around her character, and it's very important to the story. So I won't go into any of that, but I'm so happy with how her character turned out. I think the Harkonnens are awesome in this movie. Vladimir and Raban have some really cool scenes, but there's one character in particular, and looking at me right now, you can probably guess who I'm about to talk about, but I can't get Fade Ralpha out of my head. I can't do it. I had to create this avatar for the Film Threat podcast that I did reviewing this movie with a bunch of fans. And then for this review, I have to use it again because he is stuck in my head, guys. Austin Butler's Fade Ralpha, who is a Harkonnen, is so incredible in this movie. He's the best character. He's the best character. And they definitely give him enough screen time. I was really worried about it, but they do. There's a whole chunk of time in this movie that's spent on Giedi Prime, revolving around Fade and his psychotic insanity. And it's so beautiful to watch. He is a menace. He is a horrible person. He's very threatening. I don't think they could do a better job presenting the character in the way they did. The black and white IMAX cinematography on Giedi Prime is incredible. It definitely adds to his this otherworldly aura that Fade's character exudes in the movie, and I just can't get it out of my head. And Fade has multiple fight scenes in this movie. Both of them are absolute kino. There's a scene where these creepy demons behind me are in the movie, and he like hisses at one of them, and it's funny and it's terrifying. And I can't talk about anything else because I want you guys to experience it for the first time and be very surprised by the delivery of this portion of the movie. Just to wrap up my thoughts, I think, I talked about this earlier, but part 1 and 2 to me is a 5-hour long single movie called Dune. When I watch this again in the future, when it comes out, I buy the 4K, I'm 100% going to watch them back to back. I have to see Dune Part 2 again for sure, but overall, I think this is one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. As a point of comparison, if you're curious, like what kind of sci-fi movies that I like, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the original Alien, Blade Runner, and Empire Strikes Back are at the top of my list. So this is up there for me, guys. I'm telling you, it's so good. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm gonna try to put out a spoiler review at some point, maybe after the weekend's over, so people can have a chance to watch the movie. And thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the review. And remember, may thy knife chip and shatter.